Right. Well, we're in our final week of the series called Broke, and this series is all about, at its core, God and money. And if you are tuning in for the very first time, I feel like I have to qualify this series every single time with the way that churches have historically dealt with God and money is basically two messages. And the first message is simple. It's don't love money. Don't love money. Kind of money is evil. Money is bad. Don't love it. And then the second one, and you probably wouldn't say this out loud because you're good people, but I'll say it because I have a microphone, is that it's kind of hypocritical because it's don't love money. And the other side of it is, so give us your money, right? Don't love money. Don't be hoarders of money. Don't store it for treasure, on earth. But pastor needs a new jet airplane, right? And pastor needs a brand new, house and a brand new car. And pastor needs all this kind of stuff. And so don't love money. Give us your money. We'll struggle with that for you. And so many of us, as soon as we hear about this idea of God and money, we become rightly hesitant. We become rightly kind of skeptical of what the people have to say. But what's interesting, and you all probably know this, is that Jesus, when he talked about money, talked about stuff, just subjects in general, talked about money more than any other subject, more than heaven and hell combined. Jesus talked about money, possessions, wealth, and what to do with it. And very seldomly, when he talked about it, did he ever say, so give it. He talked about so much more than that, but he almost never said, so give it. In fact, the only time that I can find that Jesus said give is when he said, basically give me money, is when he was kind of doing this trick and there was the fish and there were some taxes and some stuff that was involved. And Jesus, as far as we can tell, just kind of gave it back at the end. And so what was Jesus up to with money? I think he knew that was a reality of what we were going to deal with our entire lives. And so as we've been going through this series, the overarching idea is we all, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter where you're from, we all are going to deal with money. But here's the good thing about you, is many of you are young. Many of you have your highest wage earning days in the future, which means if we can start to understand what God says about money, if we can start to implement this early, then we will be at a disproportionate advantage because we don't have to correct things halfway down the field. We can correct them at the very beginning and begin to be in good habits and practices as it relates to money because Jesus had extraordinary wisdom. Now, today, we're going to talk about a parable that I think is one of the most interesting, kind of confusing parables in perhaps all of Scripture. It's a parable that you may not have heard about. And the reason that you haven't heard about it probably is because it's confusing. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. There is no hero in this narrative. It's this. It's the parable of the shrewd manager. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand and see who has heard of the parable of the shrewd manager, but it's the parable of the shrewd manager. And why I say it's weird is because in every parable, when Jesus would talk, there would be someone that represents God and someone that represents people. And generally, there is a hero, there is a good person, there's a wise thing to do in this story. But as you read through this story, it becomes evident that there is no hero in this story. And so thankfully, Jesus, as he talked in parables, would from time to time at the end explain what in the world he means. And this parable is one of those parables. And I think what we're going to discover are some things today that are deeply helpful. Because let me say this. To this point in this series, we have talked about a lot of principles. And we haven't talked a lot that's practical. So today, I want to give you some very, very practical tools that you can take and implement as it relates to God and money. So let's read this parable together, at least the beginning of it. Jesus was talking. He had actually just given some different parables in Luke chapter 15. But in Luke chapter 16, it's the parable of the shrewd manager, of the dishonest manager, depending on what your Bible titles it as. And so he, being Jesus, also said to the disciples, in other words, in conjunction with some previous parables, he also said to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man, being the manager, was wasting his possessions. So one, there's this guy, mega wealthy, very rich. He gives all of his possessions to someone else to manage. And he finds out he's doing something wrong with him. Verse 2, and he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. Now, if you've been tracking with us, then you know this. But if you haven't, this will be fairly new information. how God has called us to view what we have is not as what we have. How God has called us to view what we have is as managers of what he has. That we are, in fact, not owners. We are simply managers. We are not owners. We are managers. And the difference between an owner and a manager is an owner is entitled, but a manager is accountable. An owner is entitled. They can do whatever they want. They have the sense of autonomy. But as managers, God has given us what we have, owner has, but he's mismanaged. Now, he probably didn't steal it. He just didn't do a good job of managing it. He continues. Verse 3, and the manager said to himself, what shall I do? Since my master is taking the management away from me. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people will receive me into their houses. So here's what the manager comes to the conclusion of. I'm too scrawny. I'm too weak to dig ditches. I can't do that. And I'm too proud to beg, which elicits a song inside of me. But he's saying, I only have a limited amount of time, and I need to figure out something what to do with that. And so he does what any of us would do in this situation. He automatically goes into a little bit of panic mode, but deep planning mode. Because here's what he realizes. I have not been a good manager to this point. I have not been a good manager to this point. But here is what I do have. In light of the fact that I have not been a good manager, I have two things. I have limited time and limited opportunity. I have limited time and limited opportunity. I only have a little bit of time to do something with, and I only have so much opportunity. Now, here's why this is important. With limited time and limited opportunity, that's where we live. We live as people on planet Earth with limited time and limited opportunity. And many of us, simply because of the fact that no one's ever talked to us about how to manage money well, right? You were in, high school, or you were in college, and you learned all kinds of stuff. I mean, you learned Pythagorean's theorem, and you like, man, I get that, but how do I do my taxes? What is a W-2? I'm not really sure what a 1040 is. We're taught a lot about a lot of things, but oftentimes personal finance is neglected. And so unfortunately, we come to a place like this, and we learn that we're managers. And for many of us, it's not really a management, it's just a spending. And so we come into a place like this, realizing, like the shrewd manager, or at this point, like the poor manager, that he has not managed well to this point. But seeing into the future, he has limited time and limited opportunity. And so here's what he decides to do with his limited time and limited opportunity. Verse 5. So summoning his master's debtor one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe, my master? He said, 100 measures, 100 measures of oil. He said to them, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Now, what the audience that's leaning into this story as Jesus is talking, he's talking to his disciples, and they're like, he did what? What a joker. Are you kidding me? This is like stealing. This is like theft. You owe him 100. You don't just write it to 50. You make him pay the full 100. He said, no, that's not the point. Continues. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. We're like, okay, that's a little bit better. I'm not talking about 50 cents on the dollar. At least let me get 80 cents on the dollar. So perhaps he's getting a little bit better as negotiating tactics. But he's talking to the people, and he said, okay, you owe this, you owe that. Now, come on, quickly. It's almost like before the master sees, before anybody else sees what's going on, I want you to write down what you owe. I'm going to cut your bill in half, and here's why. He continues. And the master, verse 8, commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. This is fascinating, because If we were in the first century audience, we would never have thought that Jesus was going to commend them for his shrewdness. We would have 100% thought that Jesus was going to say, you sluggard, you dishonest manager, away from me, if you're kind of the Southern Baptist and you're going to hell, we would have thought fire, brimstone, we would have thought just incredibly negative things. But Jesus kind of pulls back and said, and the owner, talked to the manager and said, well done, good job. He pulls back in the next sentence and starts to give us the principle. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. In other words, kind of saying, I've observed this. People who live like this life is all there is to life are actually more wise, more shrewd, they are smarter, they are more observant, they pay more attention. For the people who live as if all this world is to live for are actually better at this than the people of light or the people of God, or we would kind of understand in our current context as the church, as Jesus followers. Now, isn't this interesting? There's almost never a time in Scripture where Jesus says, okay, you need to take some notes, I need to take some notes, we need to take some notes from the world on this. Let's pay attention to how other people do this, because other people do this better than how we do it. And he gives them this principle. I think this is why we actually don't talk about this verse, because this next sentence he says is terribly confounding if you just take it by itself. This is what he says. And I tell you, verse 9, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth. It's like, Jesus, what are you saying here? Let me finish. So that when it fails, and it will, by the way, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Now, I don't know if your theological radar just pinged on that one, but that's weird, right? Jesus just basically said, hey, just take some unrighteousness and I want you to leverage it for your eternity. It's like, Jesus, I don't think you can buy your way into eternity. Well, you're right. But here's what I think Jesus was saying at the end of this idea in this parable. It's simple. In fact, I think this is incredibly dynamic to how we are to operate with money as it relates to God. And this is just really simple. If I was going to take this verse and principle it down, here's the principle of what Jesus is communicating in this part of the parable. Use what you have to influence people's eternity, since this life is temporary. Use what you have to influence people's eternity. In other words, you are to use your wealth to help people, to love people, to serve people, to befriend people. You are to use your wealth. You are to use what you have to influence people's eternity. Since, and this was huge, this life is temporary. In other words, this wealth will end because your life will end, and you cannot take your wealth to your next life. And you all know that. You're smart folks. So use what you have to influence people's eternity, since this life is temporary. Now, when we hear that, I mean, there's a lot of kind of thoughts and I think questions in this, but Jesus kind of pauses and says, well, wait a second, I'm not quite done yet. So one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in very little is dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? See, here's the point of what Jesus is making. What we do with what we have, creates a litmus test for more. And so again, we would ask the question, so what have I done with what I have? What have I done with what I have? And if you're at the point where the answer is, well, not much or not well. Not much and not well. I want to give you some things that have, for me, and honestly for our church, created the lens through which we view money. This is the reason why a few, months ago now at this point, it's crazy how much time goes by. Sorry, internal reflections. I was sitting with a pastor of the church that's approximate size of our church, church on the north side of town. And we were talking, just church and this and that. And at some point, every church, by the way, who we're friends with or who is a church that, relative size to ours, at some point in the conversation as we're getting to know one another, and I'm talking to another pastor, and I've got a number of friends who, I think relationships are important and ministry happens through friendships. And so we'll sit down and we'll talk and we'll have a conversation. At some point, the question normally comes up, so how do you guys pay for your church? Like, I know I don't have to tell you this, and they're kind of projecting, so everybody's very conscious and very sensitive. But basically say, so you guys have a lot of young people at your church. And I say, yep. And young people don't give a ton. I'm like, well, one, you don't know our young people. Shout out. I stick up for you. Don't worry. And what they really mean by that is young people don't earn a lot to give a lot. Young people don't earn a lot to give a lot. And so how do you guys afford to do ministry? I mean, you guys do so much. And then the other part of it that they'll think about is in central to the heart of your church, and most people, by the time we sit down, we have conversations and they kind of know this and understand this, is we don't just exist as a church to be here on Sundays. The reason that we started a church was not just to be another church that talks about the scriptures and that praises Jesus, because that is deeply important, and there are plenty of churches. We wanted central to the heart of the entire church, ministry to the marginalized, ministry to the kind of ostracized in our community. We wanted that to be central to the heart of the church because that seemed like it was central to the heart of Jesus. Parable of the Good Samaritan. Paul, after he goes for a long time, and he's ministered for a long time, goes in Galatians chapter 1, and he goes to these apostles who were the main, they were like the superhero Christians of their day. He says, man, I feel like God's calling me to all of the peoples. I mean, you guys just stay here basically in Jerusalem, and I'm going to take the rest of the world all around the Mediterranean rim and plant churches and preach the gospel, And what they would say over and over to him was, the one thing we want you to do besides preach the gospel is remember the poor. He said that was the very thing I was willing to do. It was central to the heart of the entire church. And so I'll have friends, and they'll hear about all the outreaches that we do and the things that are going on, the things that you have so incredibly stewarded and loved and served. And they'll say, so how do you pay for it? Our budget, I know people don't like to talk about money, but hey, here we are. And I got the microphone, okay? Our budget is approximately $500,000. The friend I was talking to, their budget is approximately $3 million with the same size church, which means that we have about 1/6 of the budget that they have, which means if you do your math, that's about 16.6667, because we're a church, right? No one wants to end with 666. We're 6667 or 667, right? Like we have approximately 16% of their budget. And so it's, like I'm telling you, it is baffling to many people to say, how in the world can you do so much on so little? And the principle that we're about to talk about is how we as a church do so much with so little. Because here's what you'll find. If you boil it down to the way that many people, especially us as Christians, handle our money. Here's kind of the idea of how we currently operate. That most people live off how much they make. And here's a more wordy way to say that. Most people determine their expenses and their discretionary spending. In other words, these are the expenses I have, and these are the discretionary spendings I have. So expenses are the critical thing. Expenses are kind of the base level house. Expenses are the base level transportation. Expenses are the base level food. And discretionary spending is everything on top of that. Food, right? Like, I don't know who shops at Whole Foods, but you are rich if you shop at Whole Foods, right? Because I'm telling you, I went there, I'm like, y'all know, like, I don't know if y'all know this or not, but Four Rivers is right next door, and it's a lot better and a lot cheaper, okay? So that's the discretionary spending. In other words, you have the choice. You're going to say, I have this car. I'm going to trade in this work car that works fine, and I'm going to trade it in for another car that also works fine that's twice as expensive, right? This car's paid off, but I need another car that's not paid off, that also works and also gets me from point A to point B. Nothing wrong with that. That's discretionary spending. So most people determine their expenses and discretionary spending by how much they make. When I work, my primary paycheck does not come from this church. I am a bivocational, intentional pastor. I run our family's meat company, Register Sausage. You should buy it. It is incredible. It is God's gift to our city, you know. Just want you to be blessed. It's almost like tithing, and it's almost like a heavenly experience at the same time. It's unbelievable. What a value proposition. Anyways, here's what you know, and here's what I know. Because when I worked and we were in production, from time to time we would have someone who worked in production and they would just be doing a phenomenal job. Let's say they made $13 an hour. Well, they were doing a great job, and we thought, man, the way that they have taken ownership, the way that they have just really driven productivity, I mean, they are such a valuable person at our company. And whether it was through their request or our acknowledgement, we said, we want to pay you more, so we want to give you, a $1 an hour raise. Well, in Cottondale, Florida, I don't know if you know this, but $1 an hour raise is a big deal. People are working 40 hours a week, if not more, which means it approximates to about $2,000 a year. And here's what happened. Every single time we gave somebody a raise, if we gave someone $1 an hour raise, no one had $2,000 extra dollars in their account. In fact, almost every single time, and this is not just for Cottondale folks, this is for us folks, Tallahassee folks, this is all of us. Isn't this true? When you get a raise, when we get more, we almost always live into more. Because we determine our expenses and our discretionary spending by how much we make. And that is wildly reasonable. And from time to time, people will say, and I think this is good advice, by the way, that the way that we currently live is we, spend, save, give, spend, save, give. And so we need to flip that. We need to give, save, spend. One, that is actually really, really good advice. But I think the shrewdness that Jesus is talking about goes deeper than that. If you want to study the most shrewd people on planet Earth, as it relates to God, not God, but as it relates to money, businesses are not theologians. Businesses are not deity specific. Business are simply organizations that hopefully have core values and ideas and principles that are transcending, but businesses are simply organizations. And here's what businesses do, and here's what you know if you're in business or if you're thinking about business or going towards business. Here's what every business does. They don't spend off of their revenue, but businesses minimize their expenses and maximize their margins. They minimize their expenses and maximize their margins. In other words, when we're looking at something in the company, our thought is not, how in the world do we create more things to purchase? We think, how in the world do we spend less money? Isn't that true? We want to maximize our margins. We want to maximize our margins between what everything costs and the amount that we take in. And here's the other part. The things that we decide to spend, here's how we decide to spend. That businesses only increase spending if it generates more revenue. Isn't that true? That's the litmus test we take. When I'm talking to our truck driver, Junior, man, he's as trustworthy as the day is long. That's how I tell him all the time. He's reliable as dirt. And he always tells me, man, you're busier than a one-handed man in a clapping contest. Now, he's from Cottondale, so you got to forgive him, right? But here's the deal. When I'm talking to Junior, I love that dude to death, and he's crazy. But he will try to buy all kinds of new stuff for the truck, and I'm just sitting there saying, no, 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 no. And the reason isn't because I don't want it to be, new. I want it to work. But the reason is because I don't want to spend unless that spending actually generates a higher level of profitability. Let me just ask you this question. How much would that change our personal lives? How much would that change our personal finances? Here's what I think. If we did what God said about money, we would give more, yes. We would save more, yes. We would spend less, and we would have much more margin. You want me to tell you the secret to being rich? The secret to being rich is not making more. It's having more margin. You think about when you felt the richest. And this isn't like a prosperity, here's how to be rich, But this is true. There are people that make crazy amounts of money that live paycheck to paycheck. And the reason why is because they have determined their level of spending based on their level of income. And so they look around and they say, well, gosh, if I was going to be a shrewd manager, if I was going to leverage what I have temporary for eternity, then I wouldn't really have that much temporary to leverage for eternity because all of my stuff is accounted for. Well, of course, if you live in that big of a house and you drive that big of a car or that nice of a car, I can't really say that big of a car because I drive an F-250 for literally no reason besides the fact that I think it's cool. So don't hear me say this is like perfect moral authority, all right? But what I do realize is this, is that margin creates the feeling, creates the understanding, creates the capacity to leverage what we have for what is next. People ask this. This is how we try to determine stuff. So people ask this. People ask, can I afford it? Can I afford it? Well, this is how much I make. Gosh, I don't know. Can I afford that? I think if you just get one thing from this whole series, this could change the financial landscape of your life. Simply asking, instead of can I afford it, asking this question that shrewd managers ask. Do I need to afford it? Do I need to afford it? You should plan your budget, not based on your income, but predetermine how much it costs you to live. Because if you allow your revenue to determine what you're going to buy and how much of you're going to buy, you will always live into more. But especially if you're young, if you can get this and understand this, what you will realize is that you have way more than you thought. And what will be fascinating is when you have margin is the grounds for generosity. Margin is the grounds for loving people, serving people, blessing people, and helping people. Let me just tell you, this is how, as a church, we create our budget. We don't say, okay, this is what we project our revenue to be. And so, based on our revenue projections, okay, kids, you guys get, families ministry, you guys get 15%, and, worship, you guys get 15%, and outreach, you guys get 15%. No, that'd be silly, because we would always spend it. I feel a sense of personal responsibility for our church to make sure everything that everyone gives, myself included, is stewarded and managed well. So here's what we ask our ministry area leaders as we're creating our budget. In total autonomy of our revenue projection, what do you need to execute your ministry well? What do you need to accomplish your calling well? What do you need? We're going to create some objectives, some ideas, what you're trying to accomplish. What do you need to accomplish it? And here's what's been incredible. Here's why I love this. This, as a church, gives us margin. This is why, by the way, as soon as the COVID crisis hit, we knew that giving was going to be difficult, and for the next, indeterminate amount of period, we didn't know if it was going to last 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. We knew that giving was going to be tough. But we had the margin to say one of the biggest needs in our community is our people in groups in places that the most hurt and affected by what has happened by the downturn in the economy is not the wealthy, but the poor. And in our community, that is a food scarcity need. And so for a church that operates already off of 16% of what a lot of other churches would operate off of, we were able to feed between an initial $5,000 gift and additional t-shirts that you guys just did a phenomenal job of wearing and buying and purchasing. We were able to help feed over 30,000 people in our community. By the way, you could clap for that. That's pretty phenomenal. We were able to invest in, for some of you, you know this, but a few weeks back, Jay and the Project Tallahassee team led some meal distribution. We were able to provide approximately 1,000 boxed meals. We were able to rent a forklift to offload it, because it was just pallets and pallets and pallets of boxed lunches. But the reason we were able to do that is because we had margin. In fact, here's what's incredible. Here's what you may not know. Year to date, In light of everything that's happened in the COVID crisis, in light of all the ways that churches have been turned upside down, in light of the fact that all of a sudden we gave away a bunch of money to people in need because we had the margin to be able to be generous, to love, and to serve our city well. And on top of that, we were able to invest in cameras, in computers, in switcher boards. I mean, stuff that I'm telling you, this stuff is so weird and wild and complex. I mean, multiple signals to multiple audios. You got to like have a lag between when you send the audio from the board to goes online and different than it was in here. So people online, you guys are going to hear this about 15 seconds, after I say this, which I think is good because maybe they can bleep out something I say if I get a little weird on stage, right? But I mean, telling you, the complexity of this stuff is wild. Let me tell you this. Miss Sylvia, who is our church bookkeeper, who I think everybody needs a bookkeeper who sometimes you want to argue with. We'll just say that, okay? Because they're just so determined to count every single penny and every single nickel. And I love Miss Sylvia to death. She sent out a May report that in light of the fact that we have not been able to meet as a church for 12 weeks, a quarter of the year, over 12 weeks at this point, given away thousands of dollars and invested thousands of dollars, we are still profitable by over $15,000 year to date because of the fact, one, your generosity, but two, because we do not budget based on revenue. In fact, here's my goal. At some point in the next coming days and months and weeks and years, we've got about 9,000 square feet of this, and we're going to open up the second 9,000 square feet. We're going to have about 18,000 square feet. We're going to have an incredible sanctuary space, yes, but we're going to have a state-of-the-art kids facility. And not just for our kids, but because if you know us, at the heart of who we are is a heart for our Hope Scholars. Hope Scholars that most of whom come from South City, who we love and we are in deep relationship with. And we have many of you who meet every single week as a mentor. You work on literacy because you know that for communities of impoverished marginalization, the sense of literacy is the main thing that drives the income inequality gap, or the income achievement gap. In other words, people do better on tests in school and ultimately in life based on how much their parents make. And we are not okay with that, and we're committed to changing that narrative. And we want to create a state-of-the-art facility for our Hope Scholars that we can influence a generation. And we are on track to have over $100,000 saved up in cash just to start that campaign. But it doesn't happen because we just decide, well, I guess we got to start saving. It happens because we decide. It makes no sense to just say, here's all the money, go for it. We create our church budget and operate extremely efficiently because of the fact that our ministry leaders are laser focused on what am I called to do. And we are as the church leadership, we are as convinced as we possibly can. We want to give you what you need to do it well. But for us as a church, the ability to love and serve our community comes specifically from our ability to budget with our expenses independent of our margins. We do not ask the question, can we afford it? We ask the question, do I need to afford it? Let me give you one last piece of advice, and this might be a little bit complex, but go with me, and if you get this, then he who has ears, let him hear, in the words of Jesus, okay? If this is going to be difficult for you, here's what I would suggest. You need to open up 2 bank accounts. 2 bank accounts. Let's just use round numbers. Let's say you make $2,000 a month, and you've decided that it costs you $1,500 a month to live. Kind of as much as you can without taking a vow of poverty, or just kind of, what you feel comfortable with, because everybody feels comfortable with different things. It's going to cost you about $1,500 a month to live. You make about $2,000. You decide every month, $2,000 is going into bank account A, and only $1,500 is going into bank account B. And here's why. At some point, that $2,000 is going to turn into $2,500. And when that $2,000 turns into $2,500, if you have everything in that primary account, I'm telling you, you're going to be tempted to spend it. But if you have it set up where whatever goes into that account, and everything that comes from that account is only $1,500, you could make $50,000, like $1,000 a month a kid. It's unbelievable. I'm like paying for like a blue chip university for my kids to go and, eat and sleep and burp, but it's going to cost a lot of money. So, okay, I'm going to take another 1,000 out of that. But man, we have margin up here. You just set up 2 bank accounts. Have the primary one, have your primary paycheck go into that one account, and you just predetermine and you set up a transfer, the 1st and the 15th, the 1st and the 15th, or the 1st, or whatever works for you. You pre-decide how much you are going to transfer in, so that way you don't even have to see it. It is the smartest way that you can budget if you are not a good budgeter. Because if it's in many of our accounts, we're going to spend it. Now, isn't this true? Very little of that do you hear and say, man, I wish Ben would use the Bible. And the margin that we create gives us the ability to invest in eternity. We as a church are committed to what we're committed to because we have pre-decided to not ask the question, can we afford it? The question is, do we need to afford it? And from time to time, when we're trying to transition and do all kinds of online stuff, the answer is yes. And I am so thankful we feel in a moment's notice the need to be generous. We have the availability to do so. The words of Jesus were deeply spiritual and deeply practical. And our pragmatic ability to be shrewd managers of what God has given us the grounds to leverage what we have for eternity. Don't hear anything else here that I want you to know. We have a God so loved us. He gave his son to die for us, gave everything for us. And he's on top of that given us some to manage. Let's manage it well. Let's manage it well. Let's manage our limited time and our limited opportunity for eternity. Let's leverage everything we have, everything we can have for eternity. Let's use all of what God has given us to not ask the question, can I afford it? But do I need to afford it? And I pray that God does work inside of you. The question is, how much can I leverage? Because eternity matters deeply. I pray that God makes us shrewd managers. I pray that as Jesus pulled back and he said the sons of this world are better at this than the sons of light. I pray that, this is a crazy, ridiculous thing, but I pray that if Jesus was giving this parable to us, he'd pull back and say, except that downtown community church. Boy, they're good at that. Because eternity matters. So let's not spend everything we have on what's going away anyway. Let's pray together. Jesus, I ask that you would continue to give us the wisdom to steward what you have given us well. That none of us are perfect at this. And many of us walk into this room knowing that. Many of us walk into this room and we're at the place where the manager was when he just came to the realization, holy cow, I have mismanaged this and I'm accountable. Would you help us, each and every one of us, to predetermine what we need to live on and to leave the rest as a margin, the margin of opportunity, the margin of eternity, the margin that we have pre-decided that this is what we're going to, and the broken, the needy, which are oftentimes ourselves. Jesus, I ask and I pray that you would make us incredible managers. I pray that you would continue to give us as a church a spirit of management, that we would leverage everything that we have, knowing that our opportunity is temporary, our time is temporary, and our resources are limited. So help us to live with such margin in a way that eternity is shifted, that we invest, we use this, as you put it, this unrighteous wealth, this normal wealth, this everyday wealth, and we leverage it so that when we get to heaven, there are people from every tribe, tongue, and nation, and we got to play a role in how you shifted eternity. And it's in Jesus' name we ask this.